This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for being here. Welcome to those of you in the room and welcome to those of you joining us online today for this event on peace in times of war, ideas for supportive peace policy, and of course, a very pressing and timely discussion. My name is Katrina Dowd. I'm an assistant professor at University College Dublin's School of Politics and International Relations. I'm a member of the Institute's Peace and Security and Defence Working Group and involved in the work of the Institute, and really honoured and delighted to be here today to chair this really important talk and to introduce Professor Gearoid Millar. Gearoid is Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Aberdeen, where he coordinates MSc programmes in both peace and conflict studies and policy evaluation. He has been published widely over the past 15 years with 4 books and more than 24 contributions in peace and conflict studies. He's going to speak to us today on the subject of peace in times of war for about 20 minutes or so before we open up for discussion. For those here in the room, if you wish to ask a question, you can just raise your hand and we'll come to you with a mic. For those of you joining online, you can also use the Q&A function on Zoom, which you should be able to see on your screen. Please feel free to send your questions throughout the discussion if you're joining online, and we'll come to those in the Q&A once Gearoid has finished his address. A reminder, everyone who's asking questions, please just briefly share your name and your affiliation if possible. And please remember that today's discussion and Q&A are all on the record. So I'll hand over to Gearoid. Thank you so much.
I'm going to turn on a timer as well. Try not to go over too much. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for hosting this. Really nice to be in Dublin, from Dublin originally, but moved away 31 years ago, which is shocking because that makes me very old. But it's really nice to be back. Really nice to give this talk, and thank you very much for hosting this. And of course, Katrina, thank you for chairing. And will keep me straight, cut me off if I go over 25 minutes. So my name is Gearoid Millar, Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies, as it says, University of Aberdeen. Before starting, I also need to thank the people who funded this research. So there's 2 phases to this research. The first phase was sponsored, funded, paid for by the Leverhulme Trust, or the Personal Research Fellowship, back in 2018, 2019. Second phase was more recently, I'm still in the middle of, it'll finish in January, another Personal Research Fellowship from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Both of those have been pivotal really in doing this kind of research and leading to the kind of conclusions that I'm getting to. So I'll always start with a very quick agenda. I mean, there's certain motivation for this research. Motivations for research always then affect the methodology you use, the questions you ask, how you ask them, which then in turn obviously affects and limits to some extent the findings and what you can say about what's happening. So we'll talk very quickly about motivations, methodology. Then I'll talk about the past and future challenges to peace, right? So this is what this whole project was framed around, identifying and kind of conceiving and trying to think of solutions for future challenges to peace. But a big chunk of that is thinking about the past. And then I'll kind of get to this issue of the policies or what we need to do to better support what I'm calling peace work. So in other words, all of the work that goes into peace, like we usually frame the field as kind of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, conflict transformation. There's lots of different transitional justice. There's lots of kind of parts of this field. I think collectively, I'm just trying to collect it in this term, peace work. And at the end, we'll get back to the crux of the problem. After we talk about policy, really it's about leadership, it's about vision. It's not so much about policy, but it's about choosing a direction and following it through. So the motivation for this is, obviously I'm a professor in peace and conflict studies, and what I do is peace and conflict studies. So I don't have, my PhD is in social science. I teach within a sociology department. I primarily publish within international relations journals, and I mainly talk about culture a lot. So I don't really identify with the discipline at all. I think that's a really problematic actually position to take usually for peace and conflict studies issues. So the framing here is peace and conflict studies, right? Which is an interdisciplinary field by definition. But it's also why I came to this topic, because peace and conflict studies, although it has been an expanding and exploding field in academia and also an area of practice for 40 years, certainly in the post-Cold War period, but even really just in the entire kind of post-Second World War period, it has been growing and growing and growing. At the same time, it's had this strange kind of ambivalent position as not a discipline and is becoming constantly more fractured, right? So most people in this field will have great ambitions for what the field and what practice coming from this field can achieve, as in, world peace. But there's also been huge ambivalence and growing critique and a lot of internal critique about what the field is or isn't achieving and how it should or shouldn't be trying to achieve that huge ambition. There's these divisions and fragmentation between different schools, between different disciplines that contribute to the field. Transatlantically, there's very different kind of schools of thought. There's divisions between practice and theory. And these kinds of things had motivated me to think we really need to think through what this field is. And we really need to think through what this field is or isn't able to achieve. Obviously, in the more recent times, let's say the last decade, the increasing pace of what we might call polycrisis or permacrisis, or there's all kinds of cool, sexy ways to think about it, but the world seems to be imploding around us, or a lot of the things that we took to be granted about 15 or 20 years ago seem to be imploding around us. And this further motivated the project. And very quickly, the methodology was, there's two phases to this. 2018, like I said, funded by the Lever Hume Trust. I did around 60 interviews. And then in 2024, 2025, so up till January, I've done all the interviews are finished, but there were 96 interviews. And a good chunk of these were with academics and international practitioners, right? So 100 of these 157 were with academics and practitioners, many of whom were interviewed in both phases. So they were interviewed in 2018 or 19, and they were interviewed again in 24, 25. There were additional interviews in the first phase. I also interviewed local practitioners in Nigeria. I usually work in West Africa, which has other insights. And this time around, I also interviewed gatekeepers. So in other words, funders, people at the big bilateral funding agencies and the big philanthropies that fund peace work, as well as people who publish, a lot of the journal editors, 8 of the major journals in the field and 3 publishers of the kind of book series in the field were also interviewed. And then what I'm calling new peace workers. So these are people who aren't really in peace and conflict studies at all usually, but they're in like arts for peace, business and finance for peace, engineering and tech for peace, or climate change and peace, not really for peace in that case. But this, what I'm presenting on today really does focus on the academics and the practitioners, right? So it's really about, and heavily actually, I think I lean into the practitioners and the experience of the practitioners, in essence, the experience of the field, because that's the area of the field that I think is more impacted by policy. That's the area of the field that is being negatively impacted by policy decisions and in some ways a lack of leadership regarding issues of peace, security, violence, etc., or how we deal with violence. So, and the questions, as I said, were framed around this past and future challenges, and then how the field has, should, or can, or sometimes can't respond. Overarching conclusions, nothing good. Very little good, right? The situation, from a 10,000-foot level, if you were to read all these 157 interviews, it's about 1.6 million words altogether. If you read all these transcripts, you come away from a really bad picture. Nobody who was interviewed in the most recent phase, when I said, well, how have things gone over the last 6 years since the first phase? Is it better? No, right? And already in 2018-19, the narrative was, it's getting worse, right? Funding is going down, practice is getting harder, the UN is getting less impactful, conflicts are increasing. So then the last 6 years on top of that has really just increased this. And again, like the pace of change seems to have really taken people by surprise. It's a time of worry, but it's not a time of pessimism. A lot of people in the field, peace and conflict studies or peace practitioners, mediators, even when they tell a very negative story, they'll still in the end turn around to, but we have to be positive. Or when I might point that out, this is really very cynical or pessimistic, they'll say, well, but we have to be optimists. It's our job in the field to be optimists. We have to think that this is possible, right? But there's also clear recognition that the field hasn't been achieving what it potentially, certainly what it sets out for itself as its goal, and probably not what it would like to be achieving. And there's a recognition that we need to retool in some way. Now, not everyone phrases it as retooling, but that the field needs to reshape itself or respond differently, do things differently. And the issue really is how, right? One, what would that look like? Nobody's really sure. 2, how do you get there? So I wanted to just quickly talk about the future and past challenges. These are just the most common, the most popular. There's literally a list of about 100 codes for future challenges. It's endless, unfortunately. The most commonly noted one, these counts are super rudimentary. I mean, I usually do ethnography in West Africa, so I'm not a massive fan of just counting numbers and saying this is most important. But the jump out thing straight away that everyone says about future challenges, 68% of the 100 academics and practitioners said climate change is one of their key kind of future challenges for peace, right? The data is actually still out on this. So in the literature, there's a debate about whether or not this is true, whether or not climate change will or has been leading to more conflict. Just because the data doesn't yet say it is happening doesn't mean that it isn't happening. And most people in the field are certainly of the opinion that, listen, we're seeing this on the ground constantly. It's definitely happening. But quantitatively, you can't really verify that as a causal mechanism. But it's definitely the number one thing that everyone in the field, or the people I interviewed in the field, are identifying. The second one, and it's highlighted because this is also a past challenge, is simply the complexity. And this is where we get this word polycrisis from, right? None of these things. So also listed here, you'll see decreasing emphasis on peace, crisis of liberal democracy, technological developments, and I have another separate code for AI, which wasn't mentioned at all in 2019, but obviously became a huge big deal by 2025, 2026. Weakening global rule of law, populism, digital social divisions. That's kind of my term for, social media and all the problems that it's causing. But there's a separate code for polarization. Lack of political will and leadership, which we'll return to. Societal peace in the global north, is in real questions about whether or not the global north is itself peaceful now or can claim to be. Shrinking space for civil society. All of these things, rise of China, all of these things were big, but climate change is the number one thing, right? And the reality is most people recognize, a lot of people just say for themselves, I usually start that question, can you give me, what are the 3 biggest challenges that you're worried about? And from then people are like, oh yeah, well, yeah, this, and they'll start, and then, but that leads to that, and then that leads to this, and then, but then that's going to lead to, and it's kind of like a stream of consciousness list of, sometimes quite terrifying things, causal mechanisms that will all be compounding on each other. And people in essence end up with this issue of whether they express it explicitly as complexity or not, complex, entangled challenges that we're facing right now, and that we will almost certainly be facing more of in the next 20, 25, 30 years. I wouldn't bother to put a date on when this will resolve itself. I'm not sure if it can. Now, the past challenges, this is interesting. Well, I'll get to why it's interesting after, but the past challenges are very, 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 very different. Now, it's not true that nobody said climate change. It's not true that nobody said, for example, terrorism. It's not true that nobody said religious wars, or that nobody talked about the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and identity-based conflicts, all the things that, if I was teaching undergraduates, I would say these were the things we were worried about in the 90s. People did say those things, but far, far, far more common were things like funding. There's just no money, right? The institutions are too small. 3 of the top, whatever that is, 12 responses were in essence about funding, right? The structure of the funding, the general lack of funding, the reliance on institutional actors for funding. And the most common one, this kind of branding or understanding of peace. Again, not everyone framed it as branding, not even everyone framed it as understanding, but there was very, very commonly people tied the lack of funding to a lack of us being able to convince populations, policymakers, philanthropists that peace is something they should fund, right? In other words, was regularly people would say, we're seen as kind of tree hugger, hippie, Birkenstock wearing. Nobody wants to fund this. We've got a bad brand, right? So I ended up coding it as branding. Not everyone used the term branding, but that's what the narrative was. And that too is similarly, in many ways, about funding. Because the issue was, in development or humanitarian aid, they can reach right out to the population and they can ask for donations. If I'm in the street and I say, will you go donate some money to Peacebuilding? And people go, what's Peacebuilding? Nobody goes, what's development? Even though development is really just as complex as peace, but nobody sees it that way. Or aid, explain what aid is, right? Humanitarian aid is also kind of complex, but people seem to know what it means, right? It's bags of rice and it's water and it's shelter. It's things that people need in the immediate, end of a conflict. We don't seem to know what peace means, right? So a lot of these things, and you can see other things, the dominance of powerful actors, obviously fragmentation and division, gentrification. You can notice that a lot of these, if you look at the past challenges and the future challenges, obviously they're prospective. They're things we're facing in the future. That's kind of by definition. But they're also external. They're not about us. There's stuff out there. They're kind of geopolitical challenges, right? The big kind of sexy issues that everyone wants to talk about right now. There's lots of articles being written about in popular magazines, Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, etc., The Guardian, lots of comment about these polycrisis kinds of issues. That's what we're thinking about for the future. It's still a bit unclear, and the complexity makes it very unclear. And some things like climate change, it's hard to actually say there is a causal mechanism between climate change and violence, violent conflict. And to some extent, they're far less tractable. So this is why I'm actually focusing on the other stuff when I talk about policy and what we could do to help peace work. Because as much as we should probably focus on all of these issues, we should probably focus on complexity, and I will be right. I'm giving a paper tomorrow about the poly crisis, and I've written lots of papers about complexity. But policymakers actually need to focus on these other things, because it's the past reflective kind of internal recognition of the challenges that the field has faced in facing the past challenges that tells us what the problems will be to get the field ready to face the future challenges, right? These are in essence kind of very well-known terrain, right? So when you talk to practitioners about these, they always say, well, you know, funding, and we've been talking about funding forever, and every single forum they talk about funding and the problems of funding. To some extent, though, this is tractable. This is exactly what governments and philanthropies and the World Bank, this is what we can affect. Can the World Bank change climate change? Can the world stop mass mobilization of people? Can the World Bank, I don't know, solve global inequality? I mean, maybe. Can the World Bank quadruple its funding for peace building? Yes, right? Very easily. Peace building is giving almost no money at all, right? Be very simple to triple or quadruple or multiply it by 10 times. You'd barely even notice it compared to the military budgets. So I wanted just to put up some quotes of like 6 quick slides to go through. I'm not even going to talk about the quotes. You can read the quotes while I talk, but they're simply chronic underfunding. So both of these quotes are from 2019. Already in 2019, practitioners were identifying a lack of funding for the field as simply ridiculous. And the reality is, the Global Peace Index, which is like a research think tank type organization, their figures for 2023 was that it's 49.6, I think, but pretty much $50 billion is spent on peace building and peacekeeping in 2023. 50 billion sounds like a lot of money. But military this in 2024 was 2.7 trillion, right? So it's almost 200 times as much money is spent on militaries and arms and weapons and salaries for soldiers as is spent on peace building and peacekeeping combined, right? The UN's peacekeeping peacebuilding fund, which we think of as the UN, they'll have all the money. It's like 125 million. It's nothing. It's nothing considering all the wars that are going on. And this money has, as these quotes kind of articulate, been going down and down and down, less and less and less, as the violence has been increasing, and we've got more and more conflict actors and conflicts going on around the world, right? The money is simply not enough. On top of that, so these are 2019, the first phase, already an articulation of there's just not enough money. This is the more recent phase, 2 different people, as you can see from the codes. This is different practitioners talking 6 years after the other practitioners, or 5 years, I suppose. And since then, it's got worse. And you all know why, I'm sure. You'll have seen in the news, even if this isn't your field, you'll have seen, the UK, the Swedes, the Germans, the Americans, everyone pretty much cutting their funding for peace building, peacekeeping, development. It's all being chopped. In the interviews I did with the philanthropists, the people from the funders, the philanthropists even we're just trying to backstop. Like, all we can do right now is try to fill in where USAID or DFID or the Swedes have pulled their money. We're just trying to backstop for that right now. The idea that we could think strategically about the field is a bit off the table, right? We're all just trying to make it stand up and survive. Now, what this leads to, this is where policy is so important. Policy is always, which I'll say later again, policy is always the context. Right? Policy is the context. It creates the environment in which funding and therefore practice happens, right? And unfortunately, when funding gets pushed, less and less, practice gets inherently more and more conservative, inherently less and less creative and willing to take risks, more and more about just saving our institution and making sure we don't collapse because 2 or 3 or 400 people are dependent on us for their jobs, or because there's people on the ground who depend on us for their jobs, and they will literally be out of a job and potentially starving if we don't maintain their salaries. The response, in essence, from kind of very rigid, very short term, very limited funding, is that the whole sector becomes, I don't want to say less creative as in it's all about art. That's where this kind of tree hugger, I'm not saying they have to be creative as in it all have to be about arts or performance or theater, but simply unable to do your job. Right? You're not able to be flexible, right? This first Second quote, from somebody who works in policy, from evaluation. And they were articulating the way he's seen programs where they've identified the problem within kind of weeks or months of the start of a program, but they can't actually change the program because there's no flexibility in the funding, because the donors make it so restrictive and so short-term and so small that you can just kind of barely get by implementing the thing. And so there's no flexibility in it. And so bad practice follows from constantly thinking you're under threat and your funding is really small and you have to do just what you're told to do. And this is where this term, I'd never heard this term before starting this project, projectized. All the practitioners talk about being projectized. And so I've really thought a lot about what that means, right? But it really means that just kind of, instead of thinking long-term, instead of thinking strategically, instead of thinking about building your organization or making new partnerships, everything becomes about just what's limited within this little budget that tends to be kind of 6 to 18 months, tends to be with 1 or 2 partners, and it becomes extremely limiting on what can be achieved, right? Now, when we think of something like peace building or transitional justice, certainly conflict transformation, and I don't know how aware you are of these terms, but particularly conflict transformation or reconciliation, these are things that like inherently require flexibility. They inherently require responsiveness in the moment. Bring in the people who are going to be able to provide the capacities to drive us towards peace. Projectized funding is pretty much inherently the opposite of that, right? It's having everything predefined and then writing evaluation forms to show that you did what you were paid to do. And so what we have is, in essence, bureaucracy over substance. Now, I don't want to say that this is across all practice. Certainly, I was also given examples of, yeah, but we had this one program and it was really great and we were able to be flexible. Or, well, I was working in gender and peace building and we had a philanthropist who was able to give us this chunk of unrestricted funding and we were able to do X, Y, and Z. So it's not true this is across the board. But my job is to find the patterns, right? Out of those 1.6 million words, I'm trying to find patterns. And the pattern, without question, is that peace building is being driven into a bureaucratic dead end by this, both the lack of funds, but also the nature of the funding, the restrictions of the funding, the way it's projectized, and the way that then they have to operate, right? I mean, there's literally, I mean, one of those quotes explicitly says, right, we're more doing the paperwork and chasing the next grant and doing the evaluations from this grant than we are achieving peace, right? And what is the point of us at that point? More than one interviewee literally used that phrase, like, what's the point of us at this point? And so we have the problem, as I said, one of the biggest issues is the shrinking space for civil society. And I think peace building is becoming a victim of that, as well as recognizing it as a challenge for itself. It's also becoming a victim of that. This is a shrinking space. These are the two kind of ones I chose kind of almost randomly from pages of a paper, but there's lots and lots of people just saying we're getting killed here. Right, the future is going to be mergers, it's going to be acquisitions, it's going to be peace building organizations disappearing. Lots of people I interviewed in the second phase used to be at an organization and now they were trying to work freelance because they were in essence laid off. The whole thing is kind of falling apart. And as one of the leaders of one of the bigger peace building organizations said, his concern is that what you're doing here is eating into any capacity. Right, so this is where the mediators, this is where the people who know how to do peace building programming, this is where people with the on the ground connections to the individuals that would be necessary to make peace in particular contexts, this is where they are, this is where they live. And in essence, we're chopping all that down. So when Ukraine ends, where's the capacity going to be? Who are you going to turn to resolve these things, right? And of course, we're seeing that in Gaza now, right? So what's it going to look like? We don't know, because there's very few people involved in the discussions, or at least with influence in the discussions, who have any experience of doing this before. And if they have, it doesn't seem like they're being listened to. So policy is context. I'm going to take a couple of minutes here. This is simply the notion. Policy is the foundation. Policy is the roots. Policy is the thing that allows us to create good practice. And policy, in essence, is going to drive the funding. If your policy is to remilitarize, if your policy is to be focused on security, and money diverts away from peace, then you're not going to be providing the context in which good peace building, peacekeeping, transitional justice, etc., is going to happen, period. Whether that's the EU or the US or China or anybody else. If you don't have policy going in that direction, you're going to, by default, whether you intend to or not, be going the opposite direction. And what we have to do, and I don't know how much debate or pushback there will be on this. I'm aware I'm in Europe, and I've given talks like this in Eastern Europe, and you get more pushback the further east you go. But I do think we are going down the wrong route. We have to be recommitting, not kind of rejecting positive peace as a goal. We have to be recommitting to supporting peace actors. We have to be reaffirming the rules-based order instead of allowing it to just get eroded and eroded and eroded. And obviously, I mean, I think Ireland has done a relatively good job, Spain as well, and much of the global south in calling out recent problems. But most of the West hasn't, right? And that's seen by practitioners, it's seen by the people in the global south as being an insane amount of hypocrisy. And we are undermining ourselves as positive peace actors, as in the West, the global North, the people who have all the money and the resources and like to think that we have all the talent and the capacity. And we're completely, every day, undermining ourselves with the people that we like to think we should be working with. And strategically, it's a bit of a soft power. You go back to Joseph Nye. You're just cutting into constantly your own soft power in the global South or in East Asia by kind of feeding already nascent perceptions of colonialism and elitism, and we're better than you, by feeding those hypocrisies. And so we need to reject this narrative, I do believe, of remilitarization, of democratic blacksliding, of authoritarianism. And I know that's hard to do, and that's where we get to leadership. Yeah, 30 seconds left. It's hard. That's the reality. In the environment in which we're at, we all have to admit we are entering into a very strange time where principles are directly under attack, and to stand up for principle is to be targeted by, I think, quite directly and obviously authoritarian actors. Compliance is not going to be the easy option, but if what you want to do is support peace, you really are going to have to stand up to authoritarianism. Militarism will only lead to one place. Arms races will only lead to one place. Arms are not there for nothing. If you spend all your billions on arms, you will eventually use them, right? Whether by accident and miscommunication like World War I, or on purpose like World War II, but we will use them. And if we don't stand up, and there isn't leadership, which I'm not seeing, unfortunately, to resist it, we're going to fall right back where we were. Right, on that positive note.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.